A and B and 1 and 2 and ready to go.
Hello.
Welcome. James Boggs is already here in the chat room. Always good to see him. Um, you guys will notice, you folks will notice that there are two and not three this evening. Rob is out with some personal stuff, so give him some thoughts, and he will be back to us next week as soon as possible. If you're paying attention, you will also notice, at least on Facebook and possibly on YouTube if they did not fix it, like I told them to, that the episode is called Hauntings because I can't
Yes.
find my tea,
I
apparently.
I told him to blame me and my love for chaos.
But the episode is supposed to be hauntings, spirits, and death echoes, which I was not aware that death echoes as a term was specifically tied to somebody in this room's favorite show. Because I thought, oh, there's going to
No.
be a regular article about it. And no, the only
Nope.
reference is from your favorite shows. So
Yep.
there you go.
You're welcome.
Um, P.S. Haunting Spirits and Death Echoes here on This Uncanny Earth, episode 284. So before we dive into that topic, let's just check in. How are we all doing tonight? How are you doing today, intern Steven?
Working on growing my hair out for the headbanging.
We got to get back to we had our old music that other shows who
Yeah.
don't need to be named
That we
complained
don't
about all the
talk
time.
about.
Yeah, they always liked to complain about the fact that we used heavy metal bumper music. And I might go back to that just to annoy them because I know it does.
Yes.
But that'll give you an excuse. Um, as for me, it's been hot. It has been hot here in
Yes.
Ohio for the last few days. I know there's a heat wave going on all through parts of the South on up into us, followed by storms and all kinds of stuff. So it's been pretty hot,
It's
unseasonably hot.
71 over here.
It was yesterday, I believe, was the day where it said it beat the record for how hot it usually gets on that particular day every year. Like it
Oh
was
wow.
88 degrees. And for people who might be listening or watching overseas where you use Celsius instead of Fahrenheit like us Americans here, um, that's 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty hot for us here in Ohio at this point in the year. We should be getting some spring, but I think we're just going to skip spring. We went from winter and we're just going to skip spring and go straight into summer. We don't need spring. Don't need spring. But yeah, okay. So let's get into the topic here. We're going to be revisiting a topic that we've talked about before. That's always been real interesting. We're going to be talking about hauntings with a T,
Not
spirits,
hauntings.
and residual hauntings and that kind of thing. So first off, let me ask you, Stephen the intern, when
Yes.
you think of ghosts, the word ghosts, when you hear that, when you hear
Yeah.
somebody say, I saw a ghost, what does that make you think of?
Well, you just said it. Typically, I would think of a vengeful spirit because it's going to have enough energy that it can appear and manifest itself so that someone is able to see it. And I feel that that is going to be pretty easy for a vengeful spirit because that's why they're called a vengeful spirit, because they're really angry and that's why they're still here.
And that's a pretty common outlook as well. According to our good buddy Wikipedia, which should be your first stop, but not at all your last stop when looking for any sort of information. I always go to Wikipedia first just to see what the basics people are saying about it, and then I go to more refined sources to get some better information. So there's a pro tip for everybody out there. You can start with Wikipedia, but don't take that as your first, like, absolute, okay, this is the top and bottom of the subject. But as
You
a
get
starting
multiple
point,
sources.
that's right. Always check your sources. Um, as a starting point, Wikipedia defines a ghost as the soul or spirit of a dead person or non human animal that is believed to be able to appear to the living, which is a pretty basic but relatively accurate description of things that happen. Um, they go on later on. I want to say this just to give both sides of the argument that we're going to be talking about tonight. they go on to say that the overwhelming, and that's a pretty loaded word, I wouldn't say overwhelming, but the consensus of science, take out the overwhelming, is that there is no
Yeah.
proof that ghosts exists. They follow that up, however, with their existence is impossible to falsify. So while you cannot say
Yeah.
that they do exist, you also can't say that they don't, because there's not
I
any good
mean,
or bad evidence either way.
I have a tuna sandwich over here on this table to my left. You can't prove that I don't.
I can't prove you have it either because I don't see it.
Exactly.
Even if you hold it up, it could just be fake. It could be a
Yeah.
prop. So, it's good that they put that in the article at least, instead of just presenting the consensus, as they like to say, the overwhelming consensus. And they go on to say that it could be due to certain toxic and psychoactive plants, that it could be certain anticholinergic compounds that are linked to dementia. These compounds are substances that block the action of neurotransmitters in the brain. So, if anybody doesn't know what that is, which I didn't, and they also say recent research has indicated that ghost sightings may be related, maybe, not definitely, related to degenerative brain diseases such as Alzheimer's, and also caused by certain over-the-counter sleep aids and various other things. So that's the other side of the argument
Maybe that's
against
why
it.
older people see ghosts sometimes.
That's a potential too, because you do get a lot more, you get more sightings of spirits on average in the very young and the very old. The very young, because the imagination is still very, very powerful,
Yeah.
for one thing, if you're going to use that as a discounted, and then the very old, because they've got a lot of things going on as their brain is starting to fail in their age. So, and that's not to say that anybody who's elderly has a failing brain. It's a common feature as we all grow old. So, with that being said, um, Rob and I have had a lot of talks on this show that lean into the echo aspect, which we're going to get to a little bit later. I want to start off with some other things first,
All
because I
right.
know you've been hitting this pretty hard, Stephen.
Yeah.
Um,
About 6
and
pages.
I'm going to go bit by bit and pat, like, do kind of a bounce back and forth
All right.
with you on some of these things, because I have a good idea on some of the stuff that you've looked into, I think, and we're going to do some discussion on it. There's generally considered, for people who are believers, that there's four kinds of hauntings. And the first one, which is, I think, probably the most likely and the closest from my point of view, is a residual haunting. Um, and a residual haunting is known as a place memory, and it's involves not necessarily a real actual spirit, but the leftover energy of a spirit or a person that's passed on, that's still kind of filling the place up. The place is kind of absorbed the feelings and the emotions and the thought patterns that are kind of going on a loop. Now, I know this ties into, again, your favorite show.
Yep.
So, residual hauntings. How do you feel about that, and what do you have about that part of the subject?
Okay, so the fact that you actually called them residual hauntings, that is the correct terminology. Because when I was looking up death echoes, I actually had to search residual hauntings to actually find it and then, get the information from there. So basically, a death echo, like I just said, is another name for residual haunting, and these typically occur when a traumatic event, such as a murder or taking one's own life, can result in negative energy seeping into the surroundings and causing what is known as a residual haunting, which results in the quote unquote ghost or ghosts being trapped in an endless loop of their own death. And as you've mentioned, the term was originally coined by the longest running horror genre TV show in all of television history, Supernatural, which summarized it in their show as someone reliving death repeatedly on a loop. And I added, it's kind of like Groundhog's Day from hell.
Mhm.
And then there was some instances. I took some notes on some instances at a college where they had some stuff, and I'm gonna summarize it because it's a lot. But there was a woman named Kathy, and she was a victim of a residual haunting, but it never harmed her. She would just see things, And interestingly enough, she ended up getting, by Ted Bundy.
Mm, mm.
So I could go into that a little more if you wanted, but I didn't really feel that was exactly relevant.
It is an interesting fact. It is an interesting
Yeah.
coincidence because occasionally, and that'll possibly be something for a future show because that's a little bit of synchronicity almost,
Yeah.
in that something strange will happen to people and then something else unrelated but equally strange will happen later in their life or at another point. And while they're not directly related, you kind of have to wonder if there was some influence from one event over the other that we're just not
Yeah.
connecting the dots on. But that is an
Like in this
interesting point.
case, if the haunting or the location had anything to do with Ted Bundy appearing there, maybe.
Because and not to get too far off the topic, but
Yeah.
um, you do sometimes get people who are known serial killers and things like that who say that, oh, yeah, I came to this particular town or this particular place because I was drawn to it. And that's where I decided to do my crimes or whatever, because I was drawn to this place for this particular reason.
Yeah, like there was a movie a few years ago. I don't remember what it was called right now. Actually, hold on, give me 1 second.
Ding, ba-ding, ding, ding, da, ding, ding, ding. This is the lookup music. Ding, ba-dum, ba-dum, ding, ding, da, ding, ding, da, ding, da, ding, 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 da, ding, ding.
Okay, I found it. It was called The Devil Inside Me. And it was an interesting movie about heart transplant surgery. And when they got the heart transplant, basically they started getting haunted. And that was one instance. But another thing that also was interesting was a few years ago they made another movie, like you had mentioned, that sometimes they say that it's related to spirits or other things, right? Is that what you were saying,
Mm.
basically? Yeah, there was this movie a few years ago, in addition to that one, that was about a man in prison, and he was locked up, for a bunch of crimes and stuff, and, they were, like, so brutal and, gory and devastating and stuff, and he kept swearing up and down that he didn't do it, dot, 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 because he was possessed by a demon. And that's one theory I personally have. I haven't, I didn't really like get to look into this yet, but I kind of brainstormed some ideas. And one theory I had was I actually wonder if demons are basically just like ghosts with a big ego. Because that's kind of how they were presented in Supernatural. They kind of presented demons as ghosts, but with a bigger ego. Because when you die, you go to heaven or hell. Some people believe that, and depending on which one you go to, some people believe that when you go to hell, you become a demon. All human souls become demons when they go to hell. So that would be one thing to wonder about.
Now that's another interesting segue here because one of the four main types of hauntings is also a demonic haunting. If you're of the more religious bent, and in a
Oh,
demonic haunting, this
yes, I
is
saw that.
this is according to the information that I pulled on these four is from psychiclibrary.com. I can't vouch for them personally. I looked them up today, but they seem to be decent enough. Um, and they, according to them, the main goal of a demon, as we've talked about in the show before, is to break down a person's free will so that they can take over and possess the individual. And then the deceptive spirit enters a home or location to do harm and destroy all that is quote good and sacred. A demon
Yeah.
can
They need permission, right?
right. You have to invite them in some fashion, and usually they'll try
Yeah.
to convince you that you need their help. But they can also attach themselves to objects, which is how you get
Cursed
cursed
objects,
objects.
like the
And
Annabelle doll.
yep, and supposedly Robert the Doll and a few of the other things that over the years we've heard about people having uh,
Like
really
Chucky in pop culture.
very poor encounters with. Um, James says he thinks disembodied demons are responsible for all interactive hauntings, and that's a fairly common
Yeah.
belief too among more religious-minded people. And I don't say that in, of course, a positive or negative or any sort of way. It's just a point that I'm making. James knows that, but for anybody else watching, I'm not. swinging a hammer at James and being like,
Yeah.
"Wah, that's just because you're religious people."
Mhm.
I'm not saying that. Sometimes we got to say that in case people are like, "What did you just say?" Um, but demonic hauntings are, while not necessarily the most common, they are some of the most popularized.
Emily Rose.
hmm A lot of our media that deals with hauntings is deals with demonic hauntings more than any other form of haunting. We've got several on poltergeist, which I'm going to get to in a minute here too.
Nice.
But demonic hauntings seem to be the number one that people think of, because when they think about hauntings, they think about something frightening. They think about something violent or bizarre or just out of character. What do you have about the theory about demonic hauntings?
I'm honestly undecided because I think it could be demons, but it could be ghosts, and I'm honestly undecided on if I believe that demons and ghosts are different things, or if they're the same thing, or if some are ghosts and some are demons. It's a lot to, make up your mind about, and I feel like there's a lot of evidence supporting it, but I feel like there's just as much evidence denying it. So it's hard for me to make up my mind, to be honest.
And that's true because just like the other ones, it's difficult to say for sure. You've got a lot of instances of exorcisms and whatnot going in to try to deal with demonics, hauntings, and whatnot, and demonic possession. But you have to wonder how much of that is
For
external
Hollywood,
influence, yeah, and how much
like
of it is
Paranormal
just.
Witness, that was a good show if anyone ever watched that.
And there's been times where, as we've talked about in certain previous cases, where it's most likely that somebody had a severe mental illness, and that's why they couldn't be exorcised because they didn't have anything possessing them. It was just they were severely having some problems. Um, so that's an interesting one. Um,
Yeah.
I'm not going to put in my thoughts about these in general until we get to the end here, so I'm going to
Okay.
keep on kind of going ahead. Um, Closer related to the demonic haunting is the poltergeist haunting.
Like
And
the movie.
mhm, a poltergeist, the word translates more or less into noisy ghost. It comes from the German words poltern, which means to make noise, and Geist, which means ghost. Um, and these are the ones that are usually involved with things moving about your house. Sometimes it's just minor, like sometimes a door will open or a chair will slide along the floor, and other times it's more violent and more frenetic. You'll get objects thrown across rooms or
Yeah.
knocked over or collapsed, and no matter
Or
how stable you make them, they're disheveled.
I have a good one for you.
Lay it
So
on us.
obviously my source is Supernatural once again. There was an episode, season 1, episode either 10 or 11, was called Home, and they had to go back to their house, blah blah blah. But it was being haunted by a poltergeist, and when they started to try to cleanse the house by putting their, bags in the walls to try to cleanse the house, the poltergeist started fighting back, and it ended up trying to strangle one of them with a phone cord. And before they got there, it also lured it. There was a problem with the garbage disposal in the sink, and well, you know where that led with a poltergeist.
Now, an interesting thing, because I'm going to get into a book series dealing with ghosts that talk about poltergeists in a kind of a fun way. Um, but the interesting thing about poltergeists, these kind of hauntings, is that they can go a myriad of ways. A lot of times, they seem to be like they're just kind of playing tricks on you, like they're just trying to
Yes.
annoy you, to irritate you, and they're not necessarily out to hurt you. And it only seems like when you're getting frazzled and frustrated, and the more like worked up you are about it, the worse it gets, which almost can mean perhaps that it's some form of,
Fairies.
well, getting away from that for a minute, more focused on like if you're going to look at it from a scientific way,
Yeah.
it's it's almost more like the energy that you're giving off. the more irritated you
The law
get,
of
the more worked up you
attraction.
get, the worse the environment gets around you because you're
Yeah.
pumping that energy out into it, which
I
could mean
can
that there's
definitely feel
something
that sometimes.
intelligent out there absorbing that energy and using it to get meaner, or it could just be that you're causing the whole thing, which has been an
Yeah.
interesting
Placebo.
yeah, and that has happened a few times throughout history. There have been people who've had supposed poltergeist,
Mass
um,
hysteria stuff.
that kind of thing, and then maybe somebody gets therapy or somebody gets like, hey, you know what? I have to go through this thing. I got to get some help. I got to get out of the environment, and because they become a calmer person or a more stable person, then these things don't happen. And some people will say, oh, well, it's because you cut off the ghost. It's not going to bother you because you've blocked it from you. But it could also be because you've addressed something in your own mental state. Um, a book series that I read, and I think there's even like one more that I haven't because I lost track of how many there were. I read almost all of them. It's a series by Dean Koontz called Odd Thomas,
Oh, I've
and
heard of that.
the first book was great. The second book was iffy. The third book was not bad, and then there's a fourth book that I know of that was I don't know. I wasn't super impressed by it. And then I think there was a fifth book that I just was kind of like, okay, he's kind of jumping the shark with this. And there was a movie um for it starring somebody familiar.
Hang
Um
on, I got it.
I think it's Tom Holland, the guy who played the latest Spider-Man. I think. I could be wrong. But
His name is Anton Yelchin, and it was released in 2013.
oh yeah, and I don't think I think he's not around anymore, honestly. I think because he was in one of the newest Star Wars or Star Trek, one of the newest Star Trek prequels, and I think he
And
passed.
Willem Dafoe played Wyatt Porter.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, it had some fairly big names on it. I mean, the movie was not nearly as good as the first book, but it wasn't bad. It did well enough.
I
But
agree, James.
I'm gonna put
Over
that up
there.
for him
Yeah.
as well. Mhm. And in the book series, there's a young guy, and he's in his 20s, named Odd Thomas, and that's his actual name. His parents gave him the name Odd because his mother was crazy. He visits her at some point in one of the books, and I think eventually she passes on. She's in like an asylum or something like that because she's crazy, and he can see spirits, and generally he can see them because they've suffered some kind of violent death or something of that nature, and they need his help to help them move on. And most of the time that involves catching a criminal that caused their death or solving some kind of case. So it's almost like a detective series, but not really. And so one of the interesting points, getting back to the poltergeist
Mhm.
um, discussion, is that there's a couple of spirits he meets, and none of the spirits can speak to him. If they can speak, he can't hear the words that they say. So they're completely silent, and they can only act like this and try to get his attention. But he meets two poltergeists in the course of the novels, at least two, maybe three, but at least two. One of them is Frank Sinatra.
Oh, that's awesome.
And Frank Sinatra, because of he would sometimes get worked up about stuff in life, and he'd get to drinking, and he'd get to fighting, and so he became a poltergeist. So there'd be times when, like, there was a time in one of the books where he was talking to a villain, and they had like the villain had him like, I'm gonna get you and whatever. And Frank Sinatra just because he hangs around with Odd Thomas. It's a weird thing, but the celebrity ones kind of follow him around. Like they maybe expect someday he's gonna help them, but they don't want to be helped yet. They just want to hang out and help watch him work.
Sounds like a great sitcom.
So, but Frank Sinatra's there, and he's like, you know what? I'm in this bad spot. I don't know how to get out of it, but I know what to do. So he talks to the villain about Frank Sinatra's music, and he maneuvers the villain into talking badly
Oh
about
no,
the
you
music
don't do that.
and about Frank Sinatra's life. And he's like, he's over there, and and Odd Thomas can see him. Nobody else can see him, but Odd Thomas can see him getting mad and the energy building up and the energy building up, and he goes into poltergeist mode, and it
Oh no.
like makes the situation go crazy, and that gives him a
Like a
chance to escape.
hurricane.
And later he's like, "I'm sorry, Frank. I had to do that. Had to get out of this because they were going to try to do something to me." And so that's an interesting use of that. Other uses, of course, we've seen the movie The Poltergeist. Not The Poltergeist. It's just Poltergeist, right? Um,
Mandela effect.
I don't remember. I've only seen it like a couple times. It's been years, but and usually you see them possessing things and whatnot. But anyway, I've sidetracked
No,
us on
the
that.
just poltergeist.
um, do you have anything on Poltergeist, Steve? Before I steal the show here.
I don't know if it's really considered a poltergeist, but it was a little interesting thing about a spirit I would like to mention.
Let's hear it.
It was called the Philip experiment. And I just kind of stumbled across this on Spotify looking through podcasts about just ghosts in general. So apparently, in the 1970s, there's a group of Toronto residents who participated in creating fake history for an experiment that is now known as the Philip experiment. All right? So all this information is completely fake. They gave them a completely fake backstory. Now, let's skip ahead a little bit to the actual backstory. So here it is. Here's the fake biography of the fake ghost Philip Ellsford. Philip was an aristocratic Englishman living in the middle 1600s, married to Dorothea, but eventually had an affair with Margot, and upon the discovery of the affair, Dorothea accused Margot of witchcraft, and Margot was burned at the stake before Philip committed suicide in a fit of guilt and despair. None of that ever happened. And so it continues from there. And long story short, they tried thinking and focusing their thoughts for months trying to, think about Philip. And basically, the way I interpreted it, they were basically trying to create a tulpa. And they thought about it and, thought about it and focused all their energy for months. Nothing was working. So this is where it gets fun. This is where it really got fun. Then they tried to create what they called a jolly atmosphere with jokes, laughing, and singing songs like 99 bottles of beer on the wall. And after changing the atmosphere, they claimed to hear a knocking sound emanating from the table. And over time, they were even able to work out the system of communication. And I don't have to explain that. I'm sure you all know about table knocking. And if you don't, I'll briefly explain it, but I'm going to try not to go too far into it. The table was basically one knock for yes, two knocks for no. That thing. And they asked him questions about his history, and he was able to answer them correctly. And then one time they were entering, one of the members of the group was entering the facility, and the table was said to have chased them into the corner and pinned them there against the corner. And some other stuff would happen too. Like a fine mist would sometimes appear above the table, and some people would even claim to feel as if they had been touched by ghostly hands. To prove that this was real, the group allowed themselves to be filmed by a Canadian television crew, and Philip still appeared, and the film crew even managed to record the sound of Philip's ghostly knocks. But Philip was pure fiction, so what was really happening here? Some suggest it may have been another spirit who was toying with them and mocking them for its own amusement. Mrs. Owens, however, believed this was proof that the mind had incredible powers and thus subconsciously allowed them to use psychokinesis, like moving things with your mind. And then yet another theory was that the group was able to successfully use table turning and used very small muscular movements without even realizing they were doing it in the first place, even if because it was being done subconsciously. And the mystery of this experiment and what went on there is still an open question to this day for each individual person. And the lesser spoken of theory, which I actually enjoy myself, is that these people may have actually created a tulpa, but there's no way to know for sure what went on there.
Now, an interesting connection with that is that's very similar to how things often play out with, according to stories, with the Ouija boards, and that while there may not necessarily be something there when you start, it's the
Yeah.
amount of kind of thought and
Energy,
belief
right?
that something exists that
Yeah.
kind of brings it out or pulls it forward. Um, James had asked if we had read anything by Charles Fort, and yes, very very interesting stuff, excellent stuff, and it's actually the backbone for a group that I follow, and we've had one of their people on as a guest. It's the Singular Fortean Society. They apply Fortean methods to their research and things like that, and they're on Facebook if you would like to check them out. They're very interesting folks. Um, Tobias Wayland, I believe, is the guy's name who was on our show some years ago. So good bunch of people there.
Back when we were still on Spotify.
Yeah, yeah. This was you gotta get the jab on there, don't you?
Yep.
Um,
Well, he's not here to defend himself.
um, the last traditional type of haunting is what's known as the traditional or classic haunting, and it is the intelligent haunting. And this is the one that most people actually think of when they think of a haunting, even though the others have been more shown in pop culture and our media and things. The intelligent haunting is believed to be due to the fact that there's a spirit that is aware and is able to interact and communicate with those living in the physical world, and they want to get the attention of the living for some specific reason. It could be because they want help moving on, or it could be because they resent people inhabiting the space that they once did, or for a variety of other reasons.
That's
Perhaps
my
they're
house.
lonely. I've heard that perhaps they're lonely, and that's why the children see them, but the adults don't, and that's why they don't do mean things to kids, but they do mean things to the adults because the adults are trying to say they're not real, etc. Um, and this is where this one says, in a lot of cases, some choose to stick around their loved ones, for example, grandparents and younger children. So they report more of these things in those two age groups. Um, this is where you get the classic signs. You get a cold spot, you get chills and goosebumps, you get the feeling that you're being watched in your own home. Um, you get the hair pulls and various things that may not seem malicious at first, but there's something that's like definitely trying to get your attention or interact with you on
You
some
get
level.
you get sounds like that sound like cats murdering each other outside of your window when there's no cats anywhere nearby. Ask Rob about that one. It happened during one of his Twitch streams the other day. I freaked out. I was like, I don't know what's going on.
You can hear like there's been talk of sounds and voices and things, and those are the type that most of your ghost hunting shows are trying to discover.
Yeah.
They're trying to discover those more than any other kind. They'll do a lot of debunking on
Oh.
various other kinds.
Wait, was it the Elk Lodge where you and Rob saw that orb?
The hostel, yep, the elk
Yeah.
hostel. That's where he saw, and that's where the whatever it was, if it was a real thing,
Yeah.
talked to me through the spirit box and tried to tell me to jump out the window.
You're like,
Um,
okay, let's do it.
no, I was calm about it. I was like, no, that would hurt me. I can't do that because it was like 3 stories up.
Yeah.
Plus there's bars on the window. There's no way somebody could actually do that anyway. So, but it was after that that the thing stopped talking to us. So it was another weird coincidence.
Yeah.
Was it actually a being trying to interact with us, or was it just my imagination taking the sounds from the spirit box? It's hard to say. I like to think I'm a fairly rational person most of the time, but it could have been in the moment. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff, and that's a place where supposedly they've had various characters of that have been there over the years in its past, and people have said that they've seen things that haven't followed a set pattern that have actually tried to interact with people. Now, as far as intelligent hauntings, that's probably the one that you found the most information on. So, what do you have about intelligent hauntings?
Intelligent hauntings. Well, I actually didn't do any research on those in particular, but in general, like what I know about them from, just my general research over the years, like I've never explicitly researched it. I'm ranting. Anyways. So basically, what I know about intelligent hauntings is, like you said, it's typically a spirit that is not in a loop. It's doing individual things to individual people, and a lot of times it's like a vengeful spirit would typically be an intelligent haunting, I feel like, because they're trying to do things like you said, like maybe they don't want you in their house, or maybe if you like move into an Indian burial ground and there's like a whole bunch of ghosts of the Indians that were used to be there, that might, upset them and they might want you off their land. And they can manifest themselves to where people can see them, I believe, but it's very difficult for them to actually physically interact with things, and that's where they need the intense emotion. It doesn't necessarily have to be anger, but that's why a lot of ghosts use anger, because it's such an intense emotion to feel. And sometimes if they can get really calm, they can also interact with the physical world.
Now, we've talked about on the show in the past about things like the ghost trains and various other things, and we've
Yeah.
floated theories that perhaps some of these things are interactions with neighboring dimensional spaces or different multiversal spaces. And that's kind of a big thing too. There's a growing
Jin.
belief. There's a growing belief that perhaps what we see most of the time as a spirit is actually a thinking, living person in a neighboring
Oh, yeah.
universe or
I remember you
dimension
talking
or
about
or
that.
version of reality, and for some reason they're able to interact with us on a certain level. And it's possible, the theory's been floated, that while we see them from our perspective as they're the ghost, they're the one like
They think we're
interacting,
the ghost.
they think we are, because from their side everything is normal and
Yeah.
we're insubstantial because we're on the other side of the dimensional space. Now, how do you feel about that, and how plausible do you think that is?
I actually really like that theory, and I think it's very interesting, and I believe it's completely plausible because recently I've seen more and more evidence that the multiverse might actually be a real thing. Like the double slit experiment is one of my favorite things personally. And other than that, when you were talking about it, it almost sounded like Jin, like when you were talking about that on the other episode previously, and you had talked about how they can go in between dimensions, and they're living amongst us at all times, and we just normally don't see them.
Mm. And we've talked about how there's different like buffer spaces. Like we talked about the
Yeah,
astral plane not too long ago, and there's various other um, literary sources that have talked about like purgatory and different things like that, where it's basically a separate side location. And it goes back to my thoughts on how the universe works, how it's like a big multi-layered onion, how you go in and you go out, and it's just layers upon layers upon layers all against each other. The closer the layers are to each other,
like
the more
Shrek.
similar they're going to be. But the farther they get, the bigger or smaller or whatever, they're going to have differences that are more pronounced the farther away they get. But if they're right next door, then it might be something very, very similar. Um, as far as spirits and ghosts in our culture, we have stories going all the way back to some of our earliest literary works. We have things from the Odyssey, where there's a journey to the underworld and they encounter the ghosts of the dead. In the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, in which some a woman known as the Witch of Endor summons the spirit of the prophet Samuel, and as that went on, we kept a fascination with ghosts. Like up into
Yeah.
the Renaissance period, you had Hamlet, you had a lot of other classic plays, um, and that brings us up to modern times, where we have an interesting outlook on things, because we have a lot of movies that deal with ghosts and spirits, and we have some that are kind of benign. Like we have comic books about Casper, the
Casper.
friendly ghost.
Yeah. Yes.
And he doesn't want to haunt people. He wants to help people. He wants people to be his friends. And his
And
uncles
that's
are
why he
saying
has to
no.
yeah, he's got to protect us.
hmm And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got
His uncles,
yep, you've got them, and then you have things like The Haunting of Hill House. You
Lady in White,
have, hmm and then you
Bloody
have even
Mary,
more interesting ones because you have in the 80s
maybe.
into the 90s, we had a lot of really interesting takes on the ghost and the spirit genre, like Field of Dreams, if anybody remembers that from '89, where the spirits of the baseball players tell them to build a baseball field out in the middle of nowhere.
They will come.
hmm
Oh, that was
Um,
on our Mandela Effect episode, wasn't it?
it might have been. It might have been. I'd
I
have to
feel
go
like
back
it
and re-listen
was.
to it. But around that same time, you also had Nightmare on Elm Street, where you don't
Yes.
necessarily think of Freddy Krueger as a ghost, but that's
That
technically the kind of entities like the demonic spirit.
that was actually one of the things I had when I was brainstorming about ideas I wanted to look more into is like, is like a ghost or a spirit, can they affect our dreams and, can they affect and alter corporeal reality? Like is a poltergeist a type of ghost or a demon? What are they actually capable of? And if they can alter our dreams, can they also alter reality? And if they can alter
Mm,
both, how do we tell which is which? Like I've seen horror movies and stuff, and obviously they're not all going to be realistic, but I've seen some where they actually give the ghosts the power where like they go into a haunted location or something, and while they're running away from the ghosts, all of a sudden they're running down the same hallway
mhm.
endlessly forever and ever and ever, or like they can loop the hallway back on itself.
Now, some of this i- is based on culture too. Like in the United States and then like in Europe, you get a lot of ghost stories that can go either way. You can get ghost stories that are portrayed as it's an evil spirit, it's trying to destroy you, and then you have the other hand where they're just friendly, they're trying to help you.
Kaidanki
Asian
in
cinema,
Japan.
Asian cinema is
Yeah.
distinctly different, where it's in almost every case the spirit is trying to murder you usually. And one of the more famous versions of this is something that I always get after Rob for mentioning because he finds a way to mention it every show, and it's going to get mentioned here even with him not being here. Is the '98 Japanese film Ringu, which is The Ring, and it's one of the movies
Best visual haunting.
that's the kind of thing that their culture sees more often. But then there's a difference too, because when they see spirits, they
S-
don't think of spirits as ghosts necessarily. They have ancestor spirits, which are good, but they're distinctly different. They're not the same thing. They don't haunt you. They're there for advice. They're there for the things. If you're being haunted by something, then it's explicitly out there to try to harm you.
okay, also when you mentioned Ringu and Juon,
Mm,
I was just looking up kaidan, which because I wanted to make sure I got the definition what I thought it was, and kaidan in Japan refers to any ghost story or horror story, but it has an old-fashioned ring to it that carries the connotation of Edo period Japanese folk tales, and it's not as widely used as it once was, but Japanese horror books and films such as Ju-on and Ringu would more likely be labeled by katakana. And another thing that I remembered, I think it's called Kaidanki with a KI at the end, if I'm not mistaken, is 100 ghost stories that they tell in a row. eh, and they have to try to get all these ghost stories done before the candle burns out. And if they don't get through 100 ghost stories before the candle burns out, then like something bad will happen. It's like a game that they play
mhm.
in high schools.
So it's interesting how we interpret encounters that could be of a I don't want to say a spiritual nature necessarily, but of a ghostly
Yeah.
nature, and how we talk about them with different people. Because most of the time, when you watch the ghost hunting shows, a lot of times they'll go in, and if they believe that there is something there,
And they
nine
trip over
times
their
out of
foot.
10, well, I mean, getting past some of the campiness of some of it,
Yeah. I
um,
enjoy them.
when they get to their conclusions, a lot of times they'll conclude that it's something that doesn't really mean people harm. It's just there for whatever reason,
Yeah.
and they can, if they adjust certain ways of how they interact with their home and whatnot, then the spirit should leave them alone mostly. It's very rare unless you're watching the one with oh,
Zach
what's his name?
Baggins.
Yeah, with Zach Baggins. Unless you're
Yep,
watching
my
his stuff, in
go-to.
which case every ghost is definitely out to possess you
Or
and kill
trip
your
you.
friends and do things and push you downstairs.
Yes.
Um, I don't think that that's accurate
I love it
myself.
though.
I mean, it's
Very
entertaining
entertaining.
sometimes,
Yes.
but I don't go out of my way usually to watch a whole lot of Zach Baggins.
Yeah, nah.
Because
Just
it's
if it's
almost always
on.
that. It's almost
Yeah.
something like, oh, it's a terrible spirit. It's here to destroy
Yeah.
you. It's gonna throw you down the well.
It's like if it's on, I'll watch it. Otherwise,
But that's an interesting thing too, is that you get that there's always the one hand, oh yeah, we're trying to convince people that there's nothing to worry about, and on the other hand, we're trying to scare
yeah.
the crap out of you. Um, Now, as far as hauntings and spirits in general, when you think about the four types of hauntings, we've gone over which ones are the most, what the article and various media thinks is going to be the most likely. But out of the four types of hauntings, the demonic, the poltergeist, the intelligent, and the residual, which one do you think is the most likely?
The most likely, I would say, honestly, I believe demonic. Because their whole intent is to cause chaos and panic in the world. So, if you believe in that stuff.
Mm. And that's valid. For myself, generally, I lean a lot more towards residual hauntings because the way that I look at it is, since
The
everything
energy
is
is left
energy
over.
based,
Yeah.
I don't see most of the time of a spiritual being still being around. I feel like that portion of your energy that thinks that is you specifically has gone on to something else. I can't say what it is. I don't know. Um, but the thinking part that would know to interact with people on a certain level that experiences emotions and things is going to have gone on to wherever it's going to go to. And if there's anything left behind, it's going to be something that's just a part of it that just kind of goes through the motions, if
Yeah.
anything.
And real quick, I did actually research a spirit for you specifically. Have you ever heard of the shojo?
I am not as versed in Asian culture as Rob is. I know a few
I,
things, but
yeah. All right.
I'm
I
not
think
as
you're
up
gonna
on it.
like. I think you're gonna like this one. So it's a Japanese alcohol spirit. All right. So it has been part of Chinese and Japanese folklore for centuries, often depicted as a primate, but it can vary by culture. In Japan, for example, it is often depicted as a sea spirit with a fondness for alcohol. And yes, once again, I discovered it from Supernatural. They have to be drunk in order to see the ghost. So they have to get drunk when they go to fight the ghost. And they literally have to get a taxi cab to the location that is haunted because they have to be drunk to see the ghost. It's amazing. And I'm gonna try not to go on too much of a rant. I'll try to, summarize it pretty well. But they're often depicted holding a bottle of sake or wine with a red face and red hair because of its love and fondness for alcohol. In the Chinese culture, these creatures are known as Xing Xing, or pronounced the same way, Xing Xing, but Xing, which means alive, living. And there's a bunch of tales about them. In Japanese culture, the shojo is supposed to be a symbol of good luck and prosperity, and it is also associated with the sea and believably protects sailors and fishermen from harm. And there's a lot more I would like to get into, but I'm going to stop there for you.
Now, in a weird coincidence, that sounds a little bit like, not exactly, but a little bit like um, the uh, the voodoo Loa Baron Samedi
Yes, I
from New
can totally see
Orleans.
that.
because he's supposedly, in order to get him to work with you, if you're a voodoo
You
practitioner,
gotta offer him.
you have to give him rum, you have to give him alcohol, you have to give him
Yes.
big cigars and things like that, or he
He's
won't help
basically
you.
he's basically Jack Sparrow.
You give him a bunch of drinking stuff. Maybe he might be
Yep.
drunk enough. He'll decide like, oh, all right, heck with it. I'll help
Yep.
you out. And he's basically a spirit as
Yeah.
well. The
Something
the
to do with the
Loa,
underworld?
yeah, the Loa are very similar. They're not spirits in a way that they're people who've passed on, but they're spirits in a way that they've never been living, I guess,
Yeah.
is one of the ways. And but it's an interesting comparison between the cultures, because you think a lot of times that cultures that are separate at such distances aren't going to have anything to do with each other, but we find out more
Yeah.
and more in the
And
various beliefs and symbology.
that's one thing I love about finding this stuff out about like this culture having a similar story to that culture is like, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar enough to make you wonder, how did this culture on the other side of the world who had no communication with this other culture on the other side of the world, how did they come up with such a similar story without communicating with each other unless there's more to it than we think there is?
And there's another interesting point too, is because we talked about how certain objects are believed to be able to be possessed, like the Robert the doll and the
Yeah.
Annabelle doll and things like that. Um, and there's a point where a lot of these, where they are located physically right now, if you try to move them from there, that's when the really bad
Yeah.
things happen. But there's been times where they have originated someplace else. Like Robert the doll wasn't part of Zach Baggins's collection.
Neither was Annabelle.
Neither was she, but now they are. They've moved there, and you have to wonder if whatever
How
is
did he
associated
get
with
them
them,
there?
and how do they feel about it? Because did they want to go and they allowed it to happen, and that's why he's still able to
Yeah.
grace us with his terrible acting? Or is it, are they plotting to ruin him at some point in the future? And maybe his craziness is what they're doing. Maybe that's the influence from these things, and he's going more and more crazy and bizarre
That's great.
because of the influence of these things. So it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
So we're probably going to wrap up a little bit sooner
All right.
tonight, since there's only the two of us. And usually we'd have a whole chunk of stuff that Rob would have presented. So,
Yeah.
but in conclusion, how do you feel about hauntings, and what do you think is the best way for people to react to a haunting?
Okay. I think, like you said, a lot of hauntings, the vast majority are probably just residual hauntings. If you don't believe in, spirits or demons per se, I think, like you said, residual hauntings would be a popular one that a lot of people are most likely going to be dealing with, if not a poltergeist. And the best thing that you can really do is just, in my personal opinion, I think the best thing you can do, as long as it's not causing any harm or damage, just try your best to ignore it. Because, like, the more energy that you feed into it, thank you, James. Good to have you here tonight. But, like, the more energy that you feed into it, I feel like you're only going to give it more power by feeding your energy and focusing on it. And like I've had some unexplainable things myself. Like I spent the night at one of my friends' houses a few weeks ago, and like every time I'm over there, not every single time, but like a lot of time that I'm over there, just at like 1 in the morning, just sometime in the middle of the night, the fire alarm will go off, like the smoke alarm will go off for no reason, and there's no smoke in the house or anything. And like, we don't know how to explain it, but it's just one of those things that happens. And I feel like the more you focus your energy on it, the worse you're going to make it. And if you actually see any sort of manifestation, rock salt. You need salt. Salt and iron are supposedly the best ways to get rid of ghosts. If they won't just leave when you ask nicely. Could you please stop haunting me? Thanks.
As far as that goes, I tend to agree that most likely things are going to be residual, and I wouldn't even call them hauntings per se. I would
Yeah,
just say that there's an energy going on, and if there's an energy imbalance, then you can usually take care of it. I mean, there's ways that people traditionally do it with the sage and that
like
kind of thing.
like Rob thinks about like with the
Mhm.
frequencies, right?
Yeah, there's ways to deal with that. As far as an intelligent actual haunting of some kind of an entity, whether it's a spirit or a demon or whatever. I have yet to see personal evidence of it, but I can't
Yeah.
discount it. Like the Wikipedia article, I can't say that there's evidence for it, but I also cannot say that there isn't. So, um, I'm still undecided on that, but I'm erring on the side of thinking logically about it, and that most of these things can be dealt with on a scientific way.
Yeah.
Um, with that being said, if anyone out there has a story that you would like us to talk about, if you want to come on to the show to talk about it as a guest, or if you just want to have us read it and keep you anonymous, that's fine. Send it to um, thisuncanny at gmail.com. The email address is scrolling around the bottom there, or drop a comment on this video on YouTube or on our Facebook page, This Uncanny Media Network, and we will get back to you on that and talk about getting that on the show. We'd love to hear your experiences, and we would love to talk about them if you would love to share them with us. So, thank you to everybody who tuned in. I know James was in the chat, so thank you to him. Thanks again to Stephen the intern for being here with me tonight to make sure that we got this all filled out. So it's not just a show full of fluff, which is usually what my solo shows are. Uh,
Cotton candy fluff. Cotton candy is fluffy.
and we will be back next week with a fresh new topic. Rob should be back, and we'll hit it hard with all three of us. So thanks everybody for being here, and we are out.